Take a moment and try to imagine absolute nothing. Not empty space, because empty space is still something. It has dimension, it has the capacity to hold objects, it obeys the equations of physics, it can curve and stretch and ripple. Not a vacuum, because a vacuum, as any physicist will tell you, is a seething foam of quantum fields, humming with potential, popping with particles that flicker in and out of being. Not even the void of deep space, black and cold and silent, because darkness is only the absence of light, and absence still requires the empty theatre in which the absence occurs. Try to imagine nothing itself. No space, no time, no laws, no potential, not even the possibility of something, not even a blank canvas, because a canvas is a thing. True nothing would not be able to have a color, because color requires a surface. It would not be able to have a duration, because duration requires time, and time is a something. It would not even be silent, because silence is the absence of sound within a medium capable of carrying sound. Nothing would not even be dark. Darkness is a sensory experience, and nothing forecloses the possibility of experience altogether. You cannot picture it. No human being ever has. Every attempt collapses back into some kind of container, some kind of stage, some faint residue of space or time or law waiting in the wings. The mind reaches for nothing and keeps handing itself something instead, a black screen, an empty room, a held breath before creation, and every one of those images is already a something dressed up and pretending to be nothing. This single fact, that nothing cannot be pictured, that it may not even be coherently thinkable, is the first hint that we have wandered into the strangest terrain human thought has ever tried to cross. Notice something else about this failed attempt to picture nothing, something that will matter enormously for everything that follows. The failure is not a failure of imagination in the way failing to picture the fourth spatial dimension is a failure of imagination, a limitation you could plausibly overcome with enough training, enough diagrams, enough mathematical scaffolding to prop up an intuition your evolved brain never had reason to develop. Mathematicians and physicists work with 4, 10, even 26-dimensional spaces all the time, manipulating them with total formal precision even though no human being can genuinely visualize them, and this is fine because the difficulty there is a gap between visualization and formal understanding, not a gap in the underlying coherence of the concept itself. The difficulty with nothing appears to run deeper than that. It is not simply that human visual imagination, evolved to track predators and food and terrain across an African savanna, happens to lack the equipment for picturing absolute absence. It is that the very act of specifying what you are trying to picture in words, in symbols, in any representational system whatsoever seems to reintroduce structure the moment you attempt it. Say nothing and you have used a word, a linguistic object, referring to something, even if that something is meant to be the absence of everything. Think it, and you have performed a mental act, an act that occurs at a moment, involves a thinker, presupposes a mind capable of thinking. Every avenue of approach seems to plant a flag of existence on the very terrain it was sent out to survey as empty. This is worth sitting with for a moment longer than feels comfortable, because most of us move through life assuming that nothing is at least a comprehensible baseline, the empty slate against which some things get measured, when in fact, on close inspection, it may be the single least comprehensible concept the human mind has ever attempted to hold. And once you feel the vertigo of trying and failing to conceive of nothing, the question arrives, quiet and enormous, and it does not let go once it has you. Why is there something rather than nothing? It sounds almost too simple to be a real question, the kind of thing a child asks and a parent waves away, but it is not simple. It may be the least answerable question ever posed, and also the most serious, because every other question you could possibly ask, every scientific inquiry, every moral dilemma, every personal ambition presupposes that there is a universe in which to ask it. Before you can ask why the sky is blue, there has to be a sky. Before you can ask what happens after death, there has to be a life. Before you can ask anything at all, there has to be a something, a total ensemble of existence, a cosmos with laws and particles and space and time, rather than an absolute and total blank. The question of why there is something rather than nothing sits beneath every other question, like the floor beneath a house, invisible until you think to look down, and once you look down, you realize you have no idea what the floor is resting on, or whether it is resting on anything at all. Philosophers have a name for this. They call it the question of ultimate existence, or sometimes the mystery of being, and it has haunted thinkers across every tradition that has bothered to look up from the practical business of living and ask what living is even doing here in the first place. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger, writing in the 20th century, called it the fundamental question of metaphysics, and he meant that literally. Not a fundamental question. The fundamental question. Every other metaphysical inquiry, he argued, is a regional inquiry restricted to some domain of being, asking about minds or matter or numbers or gods. But the question of why there is anything at all, why being itself obtains rather than the sheer absence of being, sits prior to all of those regional questions, because it asks about the totality within which all the regions are carved. And here is what makes it so uniquely maddening. Every other question we ask has a method built into it. If you want to know why it rained yesterday, you consult meteorology. If you want to know why the stock market fell, you consult economics. If you want to know why a particular species went extinct, you consult evolutionary biology. Every domain of inquiry explains events within the universe by appeal to other events within the universe, prior causes producing later effects according to laws that themselves hold within the universe. But when you ask why there is a universe at all, you cannot appeal to some prior event, because prior events are themselves part of the universe you are trying to explain. You cannot appeal to a law of nature, because laws of nature are themselves part of what needs explaining. Every tool of explanation we have ever built was forged from within existence to explain particular somethings in terms of other somethings, and none of those tools were built to explain existence as such. It is as if you tried to use a ruler to measure the length of measurement itself. The instrument is inside the thing it is trying to reach outside of. This is why the question of nothing is not simply difficult. It is difficult in a special, structural way. It may be a question for which the human mind evolved to track causes and effects within a world already given, is simply the wrong kind of instrument. And yet we cannot stop asking it. Something in us refuses to accept the universe as a brute fact, refuses to shrug and say it just is, because the alternative, total non-existence, is not only conceivable but in some strange sense feels like it should have been the default. Nothing seems simpler than something. Nothing requires no explanation, no ingredients, no cause, no energy, no work. Something, by contrast, is extravagant. It is lavish. It is, when you really sit with it, bizarre that there is, as much as there is, an entire cosmos of galaxies and forces and minds capable of wondering about their own existence, rather than the frictionless, costless, effortless default of absolute blankness. The philosopher Robert Nozick once wrote that nothing might be thought of as so natural, so effortless, that it would not even need an explanation, whereas something, actual, existing something, cries out for one. But does it? This is where the real argument begins, and it splits almost immediately into two ancient and irreconcilable camps. One camp says that the universe demands an explanation, that nothing exists without a reason, that being does not simply erupt from non-being without cause, and that our task is to find what that reason could possibly be, whether it lies in a necessary being, a mathematical structure, a quantum vacuum, or something else entirely. The other camp says that this demand for explanation, however natural it feels, may itself be a kind of category error, smuggling in an assumption that only makes sense inside the universe and cannot be exported to the universe as a whole. Maybe existence just is. Maybe the question, as compelling as it feels, dissolves the moment you examine its grammar too closely, the way certain optical illusions dissolve when you look at them from the wrong angle. We are going to walk through both of these camps, and by the end, you may find that neither one offers the comfort you were hoping for. That is not a failure of this video. That is the shape of the problem itself. Let us begin at the beginning, or as close to a beginning as philosophy allows, with a Greek thinker who lived roughly 2500 years ago and who arrived at one of the strangest and most rigorous conclusions in the entire history of thought. His name was Parmenides, and he lived in the Greek colony of Iliria on the coast of what is now southern Italy, sometime around the start of the 5th century before the Common Era. Parmenides wrote in verse a philosophical poem describing a journey in which a goddess reveals to him the nature of reality, and buried inside that mythic frame is an argument of startling logical severity, an argument that would echo through every subsequent attempt to think about nothing, all the way down to today. Parmenides distinguished between two paths of inquiry, the path of what is and the path of what is not. And he argued, with a kind of relentless logical pressure, that the second path is not merely difficult to walk but literally impossible to walk, because it cannot even be thought or spoken without contradiction. To think of nothing, he said, you would have to think of something, because thinking is always thinking of an object, and non-being offers no object for thought to grasp. To speak of nothing is to speak of it, which already grants it a kind of grammatical existence the moment you name it. The very act of raising non-being as a topic drags it, kicking and screaming, into the domain of things that can be discussed, and a thing that can be discussed already has some minimal purchase on being. Parmenides concluded that non-being, in the fullest and strictest sense, cannot be thought, cannot be spoken, and therefore, in the only sense that matters to a philosopher, cannot be at all. From this single move, Parmenides derived an entire and deeply strange metaphysics. If non-being cannot be, then being cannot have come from non-being, because that would require non-being to have been available as a kind of raw material or starting point, and non-being is not available for anything. It cannot serve as an origin, because origin implies a before and an after, a transition, a change from not being to being, and change of that kind would require non-being to have some kind of standing, some kind of reality, in order to be transitioned away from. But non-being has no standing. It is not a humble, minimal kind of being. It is the strict absence of any standing whatsoever. Therefore, Parmenides concluded being could not have come into existence at some point, because coming into existence requires a prior state of non-existence to come from, and no such prior state is coherently available. Being, therefore, must be eternal. It must be uncreated and indestructible, because creation and destruction both require passage across the border of non-being, and that border, on Parmenides' account, does not exist, cannot be crossed, is not even a place. He went further still. If being cannot come from non-being, and cannot pass into non-being, then being must also be whole and unchanging, because any real change would require something to go out of existence and something new to come into existence in its place, and that two smuggles in the forbidden crossing. Parmenides therefore denied not only the possibility of the universe beginning from nothing, but the reality of change itself, motion itself, plurality itself. What we perceive as change and multiplicity, he argued, must be illusion, a mere appearance layered over a single, undivided, eternal, motionless reality. This is an extraordinary conclusion, one that flatly contradicts everyday experience, and later Greek thinkers, most famously his student Zeno with his paradoxes of motion, worked to defend it against the obvious objection that the world plainly does move, plainly does change, plainly is not one frozen block. Whether or not you find Parmenides' full conclusion believable, and very few people ever have in the raw and literal sense he intended, the seed he planted has never stopped growing. He is the first person on record to notice with total clarity that there is something deeply strange about the boundary between being and non-being, that this boundary might not be a boundary at all in any ordinary sense, a line you could stand at and look across, but something closer to a conceptual cliff edge where the ground of intelligibility itself gives out. Every later thinker who has tried to explain why there is something rather than nothing has had to reckon, in some form, with Parmenides' challenge. If non-being cannot even be coherently entertained as a starting condition, then what exactly are we asking when we ask why there is something instead of it? Are we asking a real question about a real alternative, or are we chasing a grammatical mirage, a shadow cast by language that has no genuine object behind it at all? This concern that nothing might be an incoherent notion rather than a genuine possibility will return again and again throughout this exploration, in the mouths of very different thinkers using very different vocabularies, from theologians to quantum physicists to logical positivists. But before we get there, we need to look at the other great historical current feeding into this question, one that comes not from ancient Greece but from the era of early modern rationalism, and from a German polymath who gave the question of nothing its most famous and most quoted formulation. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was born in Leipzig in 1646, and he was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most extraordinary minds Europe ever produced, a philosopher, mathematician, logician, and diplomat who independently invented calculus around the same time as Isaac Newton, who designed early mechanical calculating machines, who corresponded across the intellectual world of his day on subjects ranging from theology to Chinese philosophy to the reform of legal codes. Leibniz believed, with a conviction that shaped his entire philosophical system, in what he called the principle of sufficient reason. This principle states, in its simplest form, that nothing happens without a reason why it is so and not otherwise. Every fact, every event, every truth has an explanation, even if that explanation is not always available to us. Nothing is simply brute, simply given, simply the case for no reason at all. Reality, for Leibniz, is thoroughly rational, and rationality means that everything, without exception, answers to a why. In his 1714 essay known as The Principles of Nature and Grace, Leibniz applied this principle to the grandest possible object, existence as a whole, and asked the question that has since become the canonical formulation of our entire inquiry. Why is there something rather than nothing, he wrote, since nothing is simpler and easier than something? This single sentence has echoed through 3 centuries of philosophy, and it is worth sitting with exactly why Leibniz thought nothing was the simpler, easier, more natural default, the option that would require no justification, while something was the surprising and demanding case in need of an account. Leibniz's intuition runs roughly like this. Nothing requires no explanation because it involves no positive content at all. There is nothing to account for, no ingredients to source, no structure to justify, no laws to ground. It is, in a sense, the null hypothesis of all possible states of affairs, the baseline you would expect if no additional factor intervened to tip the balance toward existence. Something, by contrast, is never simple. Even the most minimal possible universe, a single point of matter existing for a single instant, involves specific facts that could have been otherwise. Why that particular configuration and not some other? Why anything positive at all rather than the total absence that would have required no justification whatsoever? For Leibniz, the sheer existence of a universe, layered with all its intricate structure, its laws of physics, its vast population of galaxies and stars and minds, is not something that could simply be self-explanatory. It cries out for a reason external to itself. But Leibniz did not stop at merely posing the question. He offered an answer, and his answer flows directly from the same principle of sufficient reason that generated the question in the first place. If every contingent fact needs an explanation in terms of some other fact, and that fact needs its own explanation, and so on, you face a serious problem. Either this chain of explanations goes back forever, an infinite regress of contingent causes, each explained by a prior contingent cause, or it terminates in something that does not itself require external explanation, something whose existence is not contingent but necessary, something that contains within its own nature the sufficient reason for its own being. Leibniz argued that an infinite regress of contingent explanations does not actually solve the problem, because even an infinite series of contingent things, each explained by the one before it, remains, taken as a whole, itself contingent. You can explain each individual link in the chain by pointing to the previous link, but the entire chain, the very fact that this infinite series exists at all rather than some other infinite series or no series whatsoever, still lacks a sufficient reason internal to itself. It is contingency all the way down, and contingency all the way down is not the same thing as necessity. It is simply an unexplained totality wearing the costume of an explained sequence. So Leibniz concluded that the chain of contingent explanations must ultimately terminate in something non-contingent, something that exists necessarily, something whose non-existence would be a contradiction rather than merely a surprise. And this necessary being, for Leibniz, was God, understood not primarily as a personal figure in the religious sense but as the metaphysically necessary ground of all contingent existence, the being whose essence includes existence, the one thing in all of reality that does not need to borrow its being from something else because it simply cannot fail to be. Leibniz believed this move satisfied the principle of sufficient reason completely. Every contingent thing is explained by some other thing, and the entire infinite web of contingent things is explained at last by a necessary being that requires no further explanation because non-necessity is not even a coherent option for it. This argument, often called the cosmological argument from contingencies, has an extremely long pedigree, tracing back through medieval philosophy to Thomas Aquinas and even earlier to Islamic and Jewish philosophers working through Aristotelian metaphysics, and it remains one of the most sophisticated and seriously debated arguments in the philosophy of religion today. Its structure is elegant. Its logic, if you accept the principle of sufficient reason in its strongest form, is remarkably tight. But it also has a weak point, and that weak point has been probed relentlessly by philosophers ever since, because everything rests on a single premise that is far more controversial than it first appears. Does every fact really have a sufficient reason? Is the principle of sufficient reason actually true, or is it merely a deeply ingrained cognitive habit useful for navigating a world full of causes and effects but illegitimately extended to the totality of existence itself? This is where the philosopher Bertrand Russell enters the story, and where the argument takes its first great turn toward the second camp we mentioned earlier, the camp that suspects the entire question might be malformed. In a famous 1948 BBC radio debate with the Jesuit philosopher Frederick Copleston, Russell was pressed on precisely this cosmological argument, and pressed to explain the existence of the universe as a whole. Russell's response has become almost as famous as Leibniz's original question. The universe, Russell said, is just there, and that is all. He refused to grant that the universe, taken as a totality, requires an explanation in the same way that particular things within the universe require explanations. Every individual event, he conceded, might have a cause, might be explicable in terms of prior events. But it does not follow that the set of all events, the totality itself, must likewise have a cause or an explanation. To assume otherwise, Russell suggested, is to commit what logicians call a fallacy of composition, the mistake of assuming that because every part of something has a certain property, the whole must have that property too. Every human being has a mother, Russell might have said by analogy, but it does not follow that the human race as a whole has a mother. Every brick in a wall has a particular shape, but the wall as a whole is not itself brick-shaped in the same sense. Likewise, Russell argued, every event within the universe might have a cause internal to the universe without the universe as a totality requiring some external cause standing outside it. This is a genuinely powerful objection, and it exposes something crucial about how the question of something versus nothing might be built on a hidden and unjustified assumption, the assumption that whatever holds for parts must hold for wholes, that principle useful and well confirmed within the domain of ordinary events, the principle that things have causes, can simply be scaled up without modification to apply to existence as such. Leibniz would have replied that the principle of sufficient reason is not merely a principle about causation within the universe but a much more general logical principle, that anything true has some explanation for its truth, whether causal or otherwise, and that this broader principle does apply just as much to totalities as to individual items. But Russell's skepticism opened a crack that many later philosophers have widened considerably, and it leads directly into a deeper and even more unsettling possibility, one voiced by thinkers in the 20th century logical positivist tradition and beyond. What if the question why is there something rather than nothing is not simply unanswered but actually meaningless in the technical philosophical sense of failing to pick out any genuine, well-formed inquiry at all? To understand this possibility, we need to take seriously an idea that sounds almost too deflationary to be taken seriously, the idea that nothing, absolute nothing, is not actually a coherent alternative to something, and therefore the question of why we got the something rather than the alternative is a bit like asking why a triangle has 3 sides rather than being a married bachelor. The comparison sounds absurd, dismissive, but the underlying logical worry deserves careful treatment because it recurs, dressed in different clothes, in physics as much as in philosophy. Consider what it would actually mean for absolute nothing to have obtained instead of something. Not merely an empty universe, a cosmos with the same laws of physics but zero matter and energy scattered through it, because that empty universe would still be a something, a spacetime, a structure, a domain governed by law even if uninhabited by particles. For genuine philosophical nothing to have obtained, there could not even have been the possibility of a universe, because possibility itself is a modal fact, a fact about what could be the case, and modal facts, some philosophers argue, are themselves a kind of positive structure, a logical space of possibilities that has to exist in some sense in order for it to be true that certain things are possible and others are not. If nothing at all obtained, would it even be true that something could have obtained instead? Or does the very coherence of that counterfactual, the very sense we can make of a possible somethingness that failed to occur, already presuppose some background of logical and modal reality that is not, itself, nothing? This is the trap that Parmenides fell into over 2,000 years earlier, dressed now in the vocabulary of modal logic instead of Homeric Greek. The moment you try to specify what absolute nothing would be, you seem to need concepts, like possibility, like the concept of an alternative, like the very act of specification itself, and each of these seems to smuggle in some minimal structure that is not nothing. It begins to look as though nothing, in the fully rigorous sense the question demands, may not be a coherent state of affairs at all, not even a possible one, in which case asking why it did not obtain, why something happened instead, is like asking why we did not get a square circle. The question would not be deep. It would simply be malformed, built on a premise, the coherent possibility of nothing that does not survive close examination. Some philosophers find this deflationary move satisfying, even liberating, a way of dissolving a 2,500-year-old headache through careful attention to the grammar of the question. Others find it a kind of intellectual sleight of hand, a way of making the mystery disappear by definitional fiat rather than genuinely explaining it. After all, they point out, even if absolute nothing turns out to be logically incoherent, that itself demands an explanation. Why should reality be the kind of thing where existence is logically mandatory, where nothing is not even on the table as a possibility? That is not a trivial fact. That is an enormous and startling fact about the structure of existence, one that, if true, would mean the universe is not contingent at all in the way it feels contingent, but necessary in some deep logical sense we have not yet fully understood. The deflation of the question, in other words, may simply relocate the mystery rather than eliminate it. Instead of asking why something rather than nothing, we would be asking why existence turns out to be logically necessary rather than logically optional, and that question is, if anything, even stranger and even less tractable than the one we started with. Let us turn now to the way physics has tried to grapple with this same territory, because in the last several decades a number of prominent physicists have claimed publicly and often provocatively that science has essentially solved the mystery of why there is something rather than nothing, or at least has dissolved it in a way that renders the philosophical debate obsolete. The most famous and controversial of these claims comes from the physicist Lawrence Krauss, whose 2012 book titled A Universe from Nothing argued that modern quantum cosmology shows how an entire universe, with all its matter, energy, space, and time, could arise spontaneously from a quantum vacuum, without violating any laws of physics and without requiring any external cause, divine or otherwise. The physics behind this claim is genuinely fascinating and worth understanding on its own terms, independent of the philosophical controversy it generated. Quantum field theory tells us that what we call empty space, the vacuum, is not truly empty in the classical sense. It is a seething field of energy in which particle and antiparticle pairs are constantly and spontaneously popping into brief existence and then annihilating each other again, phenomena known as vacuum fluctuations or virtual particles. These are not merely theoretical curiosities. Their effects have been measured directly in phenomena like the Casimir effect, where two closely spaced metal plates experience a measurable force pushing them together, caused by the difference in vacuum fluctuations that can occur in the narrow gap versus the open space outside it. The quantum vacuum, in other words, is a dynamic, energetic something capable of spontaneous, uncaused events at the smallest scales of reality. Krauss and other physicists working in quantum cosmology have extended this idea to propose that an entire universe could, in principle, arise as a kind of vacuum fluctuation on a cosmic scale, a spontaneous quantum event that produces not just a virtual particle pair but an entire inflating spacetime, complete with matter and energy, all without violating the conservation laws of physics, because on cosmological scales, some physicists argue, the total energy of the universe may actually sum to zero. The immense positive energy locked up in matter in this view is precisely balanced by the immense negative energy of gravity, so that a universe full of galaxies and stars can, remarkably, have a net energy content of nothing at all, meaning its creation would not require an input of energy from anywhere, would not violate any conservation law, and could in principle occur spontaneously as a quantum event. This is a genuinely important scientific idea, and it does real work in explaining how a universe could emerge without requiring an external cause in the classical sense that Leibniz or Aquinas imagined, some prior agent or mechanism reaching in from outside to trigger the process. But here is where the philosophical controversy erupts, and it centers on a single crucial word. Krauss and other physicists often describe the quantum vacuum, the field from which these fluctuations spontaneously arise, as nothing. But philosophers and even some physicists have pushed back hard on this usage, pointing out that the quantum vacuum is emphatically not nothing in the philosophical sense the question demands. It is a physical field governed by the equations of quantum mechanics embedded in space and time, obeying specific laws with specific parameters, possessing energy, possessing structure, possessing the capacity for fluctuation and change. It is, by any reasonable philosophical standard, an extraordinarily rich and specific something, not the absolute absence of everything that the philosophical question is actually asking about. The philosopher David Albert, writing a widely discussed review of Krauss's book, made exactly this point with some force. The particular vacuum states that Krauss describes, Albert argued, are specific arrangements of specific quantum fields, evolving under specific dynamical laws, and none of that, the fields, the laws, the dynamics, the very framework of quantum mechanics itself, is remotely close to nothing. Cross's account, however scientifically fascinating, explains how a universe of matter and energy could arise from a pre-existing quantum vacuum. It does not explain why there are quantum fields at all, why quantum mechanics governs reality rather than some other set of laws or no laws whatsoever, why there is a vacuum with the specific structure and potential it has rather than the true, absolute, philosophical nothing that has no fields, no laws, no potential, no quantum mechanics, no space in which fields could exist, no time in which fluctuations could occur. The deepest version of the question, in other words, has simply been pushed back one level. Instead of asking why there is a universe of galaxies and stars, we are now asking why there is a quantum vacuum capable of producing universes, and that question remains every bit as open, every bit as unanswered by physics as the one we started with. This pattern of physical explanations pushing the mystery back a level rather than dissolving it recurs throughout cosmology, and it is worth sitting with because it reveals something important about the limits of scientific explanation when applied to questions of ultimate origin. Consider the leading cosmological models of the early universe. Inflationary cosmology proposes that the universe underwent an extraordinarily rapid period of exponential expansion in its first fraction of a second, driven by a hypothetical field called the inflaton, and this theory does remarkable explanatory work, accounting for the large-scale uniformity and flatness of the observable universe with impressive precision, confirmed by decades of observations of the cosmic microwave background radiation. But inflation itself requires a pre-existing quantum field with specific properties embedded in some kind of pre-inflationary state, and explaining where that field and that state came from simply relocates the mystery once again. Some cosmologists have proposed even more radical models in which our universe is one bubble among countless others in an eternally inflating multiverse, constantly budding off new universes with different physical constants, an idea sometimes called the multiverse hypothesis or, in a more specific version, eternal inflation. Others have proposed cyclic models in which our universe is one phase in an endless sequence of expansions and contractions, big bangs followed eventually by big crunches followed by new big bangs, stretching backward and forward in time without any absolute beginning at all. And in quantum cosmology, physicists like James Hartle and Stephen Hawking proposed what is known as the no-boundary proposal, a mathematical model in which time itself, traced backward toward the Big Bang, gradually transforms into an additional dimension of space so that the universe has no initial boundary, no first moment, no edge at which you could stand and ask what came before, in the same way that there is no edge of the Earth at the North Pole where you could ask what lies further north. Hawking, in his popular writing, sometimes suggested that this model dissolves the question of a creator or an initial cause entirely, because if the universe has no temporal boundary, there is no moment of creation for a cause to act upon. Each of these models is a genuine achievement of physical and mathematical reasoning, and each of them does real explanatory work regarding the structure and history of our observable universe. But notice the pattern. Every single one of them presupposes some prior mathematical or physical framework, a set of quantum fields, a particular version of general relativity, a specific configuration space of possible universes, a specific mathematical structure within which the no-boundary proposal is formulated, a multiverse-generating mechanism with its own rules and parameters. None of them, not one, explains why there is a framework of any kind rather than no framework whatsoever, why the deep mathematical structure that generates universes exists in the first place rather than there being nothing, not even mathematics, not even the possibility of mathematics. The physicist Sean Carroll, who has written extensively and carefully on this topic, has acknowledged this limitation directly, arguing that physics can, at best, explain particular states of the universe in terms of other states and the laws connecting them, but that the demand for an explanation of the total system of laws and initial conditions, the demand Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason makes, may simply be a demand that no possible physical theory could ever satisfy, because any physical theory, by its very nature as a physical theory will always have some brute, unexplained starting point, whether that is a law, an initial state, a symmetry, or a mathematical structure. This brings us to one of the most audacious and philosophically interesting attempts to escape this regress entirely, an idea proposed by the physicist Max Tegmark, sometimes called the mathematical universe hypothesis. Tegmark's proposal is genuinely radical. He suggests that physical existence and mathematical existence are, at the deepest level, identical, that our universe simply is a particular mathematical structure, and that every mathematical structure that could possibly be consistently defined actually exists physically, as a universe of its own, with its own internal inhabitants who, from the inside, would experience their mathematical structure as a physical reality every bit as solid and real as ours feels to us. If this is true, Tegmark argues, then the question of why there is a universe with our particular laws and constants rather than some other configuration dissolves, because every logically possible configuration exists, all of them, equally as separate mathematical universes, and we simply find ourselves, unsurprisingly, in one of the ones capable of supporting observers who can ask the question in the first place. This proposal is fascinating precisely because of how far it pushes the logic of explanation. If existence simply is mathematical structure, and if the total space of all mathematical structures is treated as inevitable, as the kind of thing that simply must be, the way we tend to feel that 2 plus 2 must equal 4 regardless of whether any physical universe exists to instantiate that fact, then perhaps the brute contingency Leibniz worried about disappears entirely. There would be no further facts about why this particular mathematical structure is real rather than some other, because all of them would be equally real, and mathematical truth, unlike physical existence, does feel to many people like the kind of thing that holds necessarily, that could not have been otherwise, that does not require an external cause the way a physical event does. But even this maximally ambitious proposal runs into exactly the same wall that every other proposal we have examined has run into. Why does mathematical existence obtain at all? Why is it the case that mathematical structures, considered simply as abstract, timeless patterns of logical relationship, are automatically instantiated as concrete realities rather than remaining, as most philosophers of mathematics have traditionally assumed, merely abstract, merely patterns that could be described but need not be realized as actual universes with actual conscious inhabitants inside them? Tegmark's hypothesis is enormously clever, and it does genuinely eliminate certain kinds of contingency, certain arbitrary-seeming facts about why our universe has these particular constants rather than others. But it does so only by asserting, rather than explaining, that mathematical existence as a whole is automatic, is necessary, is simply given. And that assertion, however elegant, is precisely the kind of brute, unexplained starting point that the original question was trying to interrogate in the first place. We have not escaped the mystery of nothing. We have relocated it into the philosophy of mathematics, dressed it in the language of set theory and logical structure, and left it standing exactly where it always stood, at the outer boundary of what explanation can reach. There is one more physical proposal worth sitting with before we move on, because it was designed specifically, deliberately, to take on the philosophical question in its strongest form, rather than merely explaining how matter emerged from a pre-existing vacuum. In 1982, the physicist Alexander Vilenkin proposed a model that has come to be known as quantum tunneling from nothing, and Vilenkin was explicit, in a way Krauss sometimes was not, about exactly what kind of nothing he meant. He was not describing a quantum vacuum embedded in an already existing spacetime. He was attempting to describe the quantum creation of spacetime itself, space and time both, from a state with no space, no time, no classical geometry whatsoever, a state Vilenkin himself called truly nothing, a state, he wrote, with no matter, no radiation, no space, and, in the most challenging part of the proposal, no time either. The mathematics behind this proposal borrows a technique from ordinary quantum mechanics called tunneling, the well-established and experimentally confirmed phenomenon in which a particle can pass through an energy barrier that classical physics says it should not have enough energy to cross, appearing on the other side with a calculable, non-zero probability, the same effect that makes radioactive decay and the operation of tunnel diodes possible. Wittgenstein applied this same mathematical formalism to the universe as a whole, modeling the birth of a small, closed universe as a kind of tunneling event out of a geometry with zero size, zero radius, into a small but finite universe that could then proceed to inflate rapidly and evolve into everything we observe. In Wittgenstein's equations, the wave function describing the universe does not require an initial classical spacetime to evolve from. It can, mathematically, connect directly to a state in which the very concept of spatial extension and temporal duration has, in a rigorous sense, shrunk to nothing. This is a genuinely remarkable piece of theoretical physics, and it goes further than almost any other proposal in this space toward addressing philosophers directly on their own terms rather than simply redefining nothing to mean an energetic vacuum. But even here, examined closely, the same structural limitation resurfaces, and Wittgenstein himself, to his credit, has acknowledged it openly in his own writing and public lectures. The tunneling process he describes is governed by the equations of quantum mechanics, specifically by something called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, a mathematical formalism drawn from quantum cosmology, and that formalism, along with the very mathematical laws that permit tunneling to occur with a particular, calculable probability, has to be already in place, already true, already available for the tunneling event to happen at all. There is no time before the tunneling in the ordinary sense, which is philosophically significant and genuinely addresses part of Aquinas' temporal framing of the question, but there is, in a different and perhaps more fundamental sense, a logical and mathematical before, a realm of quantum law within which the probability of tunneling is defined and calculated, and that realm is not nothing. It is an extremely minimal, extremely abstract something, a structure of physical law that determines what can and cannot tunnel into existence and with what likelihood, and that structure itself remains just as unexplained, just as brute, at the end of Wittgenstein's proposal as it was at the beginning. Wittgenstein has been refreshingly candid about this residual gap, noting in his own popular writing that the question of why there are quantum laws at all, why the universe is the kind of place where tunneling from nothing is even a live mathematical possibility, sits outside what his physics, however elegant, can address. The barrier has been moved. It has not been removed. It is worth pausing here to notice something important about the entire arc of reasoning we have traced so far, from Parmenides through Leibniz, through quantum cosmology, through the mathematical universe hypothesis. Every single serious attempt to explain why there is something rather than nothing, without exception, has needed to help itself to some prior structure, some framework, some set of possibilities or laws or logical necessities in order to get its explanation off the ground. Leibniz needed a necessary being whose existence was logically guaranteed. Cross needed a quantum vacuum governed by the laws of quantum field theory. Hawking needed a mathematical model of spacetime curvature. Tegmark needed the entire realm of mathematical structures to be automatically real. In every single case, the explanation works, if it works at all, only by assuming that some kind of something, some framework, some structure, some necessity was already somehow available to do the explaining. Nobody in the entire history of human thought has ever produced an explanation of existence that does not itself lean on some prior form of existence, whether physical, logical, or mathematical, to hold it up. This is either a devastating problem or a profound clue, depending on how you look at it. It might mean that every explanatory strategy we have tried is doomed to the same infinite regress, each something explained by appeal to a prior something forever, with no terminus in sight, no final, self-sufficient stopping point that does not itself require an explanation. Or it might mean, as thinkers going back to Leibniz and Aquinas argued, that reality does terminate in something, but that something is not the kind of thing that requires an external explanation, a necessary being, a logically inevitable structure, something whose non-existence would be, quite literally, a contradiction. And this is precisely where the debate has stood, largely unmoved in its fundamental structure despite enormous advances in physics and logic for the better part of 1,000 years. Let us look more closely now at what a necessary being would actually have to be like, because this concept, so central to Leibniz's argument and to the much older tradition of natural theology that preceded him, is genuinely strange and deserves careful unpacking rather than simply being waved through as a philosophical placeholder. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas, drawing heavily on Aristotle, formulated what has come to be known as one of his 5 ways of demonstrating the existence of God, the argument from contingency, which anticipates Leibniz's reasoning by several centuries. Aquinas observed that everything we encounter in the natural world is contingent, meaning it exists but could have failed to exist. It comes into being and passes away. It depends for its existence on other things, on causes, on conditions, on circumstances that could have been otherwise. A tree depends on a seed, on soil, on sunlight, on rain. A human being depends on parents, on biological processes, on an entire causal history stretching backward through evolution and ultimately, presumably, to the origin of the universe itself. Aquinas argued that if everything that exists were contingent in this way, dependent for its existence on something else, then at some point in the past there must have been a time when nothing at all existed, because a purely contingent thing, by its nature, need not exist, and if given enough time, everything that need not exist eventually will not exist. But if there was ever a time when absolutely nothing existed, then nothing could exist now, because nothing comes from nothing, ex nihilo nihil fit, a principle so ancient it predates even Parmenides, appearing already in the earliest strata of Greek philosophy among thinkers like Parmenides's predecessors, and echoed independently across numerous other philosophical traditions around the world. Since it is manifestly not the case that nothing exists now, Aquinas concluded, there must exist something whose existence is not contingent, something that does not depend on anything else, something that could not have failed to exist, something necessary, and this necessary being, grounding the entire chain of contingent existence, is what Aquinas identified with God. Notice how similar in structure this argument is to Leibniz's several centuries later, even though Aquinas frames it in terms of temporal contingency, the possibility of non-existence at some point in time, while Leibniz frames it more abstractly in terms of logical sufficiency, the demand that every fact have a reason. Both arrive at the same destination, a necessary being standing at the foundation of contingent reality, explaining why there is something without itself needing further explanation, because its existence is in some sense built into its very essence, the way the truth of a mathematical theorem is built into the definitions and axioms from which it follows, rather than depending on some external cause. But this concept of a necessary being, however elegant it sounds when stated abstractly, have been subjected to intense philosophical scrutiny, and the difficulties it faces are genuinely serious, not merely rhetorical objections raised by skeptics unwilling to accept a religious conclusion. The core difficulty is this. What exactly does it mean for something to exist necessarily, as opposed to merely existing as a matter of fact? For a mathematical truth, like the statement that 2 + 2 = 4, necessity seems to make reasonable sense because the truth follows automatically from the definitions of the terms involved. It could not be false without those terms meaning something entirely different than what they mean. But existence is different from truth in this respect. Existence is not, at least on the standard modern view descending from the philosopher Immanuel Kant, a predicate in the same way that other properties are predicates. To say that something exists is not to attribute a further characteristic to it, the way saying something is red attributes a color to it. It is, rather, to say that the concept, whatever it includes, is actually instantiated in reality, actually realized, rather than remaining merely a coherent idea. And if existence is not a predicate, then it becomes very difficult to see how any being, no matter how perfect or how logically self-sufficient its essence, could have existence simply built into the essence the way having three sides is built into the essence of a triangle. You can define a being however you like, ascribing to it all the necessary and perfect attributes you can imagine, but the further question of whether any being actually answering to that definition exists in reality seems to many philosophers following Kant to remain stubbornly open no matter how carefully you construct the definition. This is essentially the same objection philosophers have raised for centuries against another famous argument for God's existence, the ontological argument first formulated by Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century, which attempts to derive God's existence directly from the very concept of a maximally perfect being, on the grounds that existence is itself a perfection, and a being that failed to exist would not be maximally perfect, so a maximally perfect being must exist. The argument has fascinated and frustrated philosophers for nearly 1,000 years precisely because it is so difficult to locate the exact flaw in its logic, and yet almost nobody across the entire history of philosophy has found it fully convincing as a proof, because the intuition that you cannot define something into existence, no matter how perfect or necessary you stipulate its essence to be, runs very deep in human reasoning. The cosmological argument from contingency inherits much of the same difficulty when it reaches its final step, positing a being whose existence follows necessarily from its essence, because that move, however carefully constructed, asks us to accept that some very special kind of thing escapes the general rule that essence and existence are separable, that you can fully specify what a thing would be like without thereby guaranteeing that any such thing actually is. There is a further problem as well, one raised memorably by the philosopher David Hume in the 18th century. Hume argued that we can conceive without contradiction of the non-existence of literally anything, including whatever being is proposed as necessary. If you can coherently imagine a given being not existing, Hume suggested, without running into any logical contradiction, the way you would if you tried to imagine a married bachelor or a four-sided triangle, then that being's existence cannot be logically necessary in the strict sense the argument requires, because logical necessity means precisely that the negation is contradictory, unthinkable, not merely false. And it does seem, to most people upon reflection, that we can at least entertain the bare idea of there being nothing at all, even if, as we discussed earlier with Parmenides, that idea turns out to be much harder to fully cash out than it first appears. The very fact that the question why is there something rather than nothing feels like a real, open, meaningful question to so many people across so many different traditions and eras suggests that the non-existence of everything, including any proposed necessary being, is not obviously self-contradictory in the way strict logical necessity would require. If it were truly, transparently a contradiction for nothing to exist, the question would likely never have arisen at all. Its very persistence as a live, gripping question, Hume's line of reasoning suggests, is itself evidence against the claim that existence is logically guaranteed. Defenders of the cosmological argument have offered responses to these objections, distinguishing between different senses of necessity, or arguing that our inability to fully conceive of true nothing, the difficulty we encountered right at the start of this exploration, actually supports rather than undermines the claim that non-existence is not a genuine possibility. This debate remains genuinely unresolved among professional philosophers today, argued with real technical sophistication on both sides, and it would be dishonest to present either side as having delivered a knockout blow. What we can say with confidence is that the concept of a necessary being, however venerable and however carefully constructed by brilliant thinkers across many centuries, faces real and serious difficulties, and does not offer the kind of clean, final resting point that would fully satisfy the demand of the principle of sufficient reason without controversy. There is one more argument in this same family worth examining because it has become, in the last several decades, the most publicly debated version of the cosmological argument, fought out in university lecture halls and recorded debates watched by millions online. It is called the Kalam cosmological argument, named for the medieval Islamic school of theological reasoning Kalam, from which it draws its earliest formulations, developed by thinkers like Al-Kindi and Al-Ghazali in the 9th through 11th centuries, and revived and defended with considerable philosophical sophistication in contemporary academic philosophy by William Lane Craig starting in the 1970s. Unlike Leibniz's argument, which rests on the abstract principle of sufficient reason, and unlike Aquinas's argument from contingency, which does not actually require the universe to have had a beginning in time, the Kalam argument is built specifically and explicitly around the claim that the universe began to exist, and it proceeds with deliberate, syllogistic simplicity. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Craig has defended the second premise, that the universe began to exist, using two distinct lines of argument, one philosophical and one drawn from physical cosmology. The philosophical argument attempts to show that an actual infinite regress of past events is logically impossible, that you cannot traverse an infinite series one moment at a time to arrive at the present, because an infinite series, by definition, has no starting point from which the traversal could have begun, and therefore the past cannot extend backward infinitely but must have a first moment. The scientific argument appeals directly to the Big Bang model and, more specifically, to a set of theorems developed by the physicists Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, the same Vilenkin whose quantum tunneling proposal we examined earlier, published in 2003, which demonstrate that any universe which has, on average, been expanding throughout its history cannot be past eternal but must have a boundary in the past, a beginning, under extremely general conditions that apply to a very wide range of cosmological models, including inflationary ones. This argument has generated enormous discussion precisely because it tries to force the same rigor onto the beginning of time that Parmenides tried to force onto the concept of non-being itself. But it has met with serious and pointed objections from philosophers and physicists working on both of Craig's supporting arguments. On the philosophical side, mathematicians and philosophers have pointed out that modern set theory handles actual infinities with complete logical consistency, that the seemingly paradoxical properties of infinite collections, famously illustrated by the mathematician David Hilbert's thought experiment of an infinite hotel that can always accommodate more guests even when every room is already full, are counterintuitive but not actually contradictory, which undercuts the claim that an infinite past is logically impossible rather than merely difficult to picture. On the physics side, Vilenkin himself has been careful to note, in later writing and in direct correspondence with philosophers examining his theorem, that the Bohr-Guth-Vilenkin result applies specifically to classical spacetimes undergoing average expansion, and does not straightforwardly rule out models in which the universe transitions from an earlier quantum regime, where the very concepts of time and geometry break down and do not behave classically, into the expanding phase we observe, precisely the kind of scenario his own tunneling proposal and Hartle and Hawking's no-boundary proposal are attempting to describe. The theorem, in other words, is more narrowly scoped than popular presentations of the Kalam argument sometimes suggest, and whether the universe had an absolute beginning in the fullest metaphysical sense, or instead emerged from some prior quantum regime that does not count as a beginning in the sense the argument requires, remains a genuinely open and actively contested question within theoretical physics itself, not a settled matter the philosophical argument can simply assume. Even setting aside these empirical and mathematical disputes, the Kalam argument faces the same conceptual difficulty that has dogged every other version of this argument we have examined. Even if we grant fully that the universe began to exist, and even if we grant that everything that begins to exist has a cause, a premise that itself has been questioned, since our experience of causation is drawn entirely from processes happening within an already existing universe governed by time, and it is not obvious that this pattern, causes preceding their effects in time, straightforwardly applies to the origin of time itself. The argument's conclusion only tells us that the universe has a cause. It does not, by itself, tell us what kind of cause, whether personal or impersonal, intentional or mechanical, singular or one instance of some repeating process, and Craig's own further argument that this cause must be an eternal, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immensely powerful, and personal being requires a great deal of additional philosophical work beyond the syllogism itself, work that critics like the philosopher Graham Oppy have subjected to extensive and detailed scrutiny across a body of published exchanges with Craig spanning decades. The debate between Craig and his critics remains lively, technical, and unresolved in the philosophical literature today, which is itself instructive. Here is an argument formulated with syllogistic precision, defended by professional philosophers on both sides with the full resources of modern logic, set theory, and observational cosmology, and even after 50 years of sustained, rigorous academic combat, no consensus has emerged. That persistence of disagreement among people whose entire profession is thinking clearly about exactly this kind of question tells you something about the terrain we are walking through. It is not terrain where cleverness alone is enough to reach solid ground. Before we turn to that puzzle of self-selection, we should look directly at the deflationary current we touched on earlier, the suspicion that the entire question might be, in a technical and specific sense, meaningless because this line of thought produced in the 20th century one of the most rigorous and uncompromising challenges the question has ever faced, and it deserves to be met on its own terms rather than gestured at in passing. The Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein spent much of his career interrogating the limits of what language can meaningfully express, and in his early work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, published in 1921, he arrived at a set of conclusions with direct bearing on our question. Wittgenstein argued that meaningful propositions are, at bottom, pictures of possible states of affairs in the world, arrangements of objects that could, in principle, be the case or fail to be the case, and that a proposition gets its sense precisely from this contrast, from the fact that it excludes some possibilities and includes others. But the existence of the world as a whole, Wittgenstein suggested, is not one fact among others that could have failed to obtain in the same way a particular arrangement of objects within the world could have failed to obtain. It is the precondition for there being any facts, any pictures, any language at all. This led Wittgenstein to his famous and cryptic remark that it is not how things are in the world that is mystical, but that the world exists at all, a feeling he clearly took seriously and even seemed to regard as pointing towards something real, even sacred. Yet in the very same breath, Wittgenstein insisted that this feeling, however powerful, could not be expressed in a meaningful proposition, could not be stated as a fact with genuine sense because it sits outside the boundary of what language, built as it is to describe contingent arrangements within the world, is capable of articulating. Whereof one cannot speak, he wrote in the book's famous closing line, thereof one must be silent. For Wittgenstein, the wonder at existence was real, but it was not a question awaiting an answer. It was closer to an experience at the edge of language, one that talking about only distorts and diminishes. This idea was picked up and hardened in a much less mystical and much more combative spirit by the logical positivists of the Vienna Circle in the 1920s and 1930s, philosophers like Rudolf Carnap and, in Britain, A.J. Ayer, who argued that a sentence is genuinely meaningful only if it is either true by definition, like a statement of logic or mathematics, or capable, at least in principle, of being verified or falsified by some possible observation. Metaphysical questions that float free of any possible empirical test, they argued, are not false, and they are not even deep unsolved mysteries. They are, strictly speaking, nonsense, grammatically well-formed sentences that fail to express any genuine proposition at all, no different in kind, though certainly different in emotional resonance, from a string of words that violates the rules of grammar entirely. Ayer, in his 1936 book Language, Truth and Logic, applied this verification principle with particular aggression to traditional metaphysics and theology, and the question of why there is something rather than nothing sits squarely in the crosshairs of this critique, because no observation, by definition, could ever confirm or disconfirm an answer to it. Any conceivable experience you could have, any experiment you could run, occurs within the universe, presupposes the universe, and therefore cannot bear on the question of why the universe, as a totality, exists at all rather than not. The positivists concluded that we should stop treating our inability to answer the question as a tragic limitation of human reason and start treating it as a symptom, a sign that we have been misled by the grammar of our own language into believing we were asking something when we were not. This is a bracing and clarifying position, and it has genuine force. But it also faced serious and, in the view of most philosophers today, ultimately fatal difficulties of its own, and it is worth understanding why logical positivism, despite its enormous influence for several decades, is no longer the dominant view in philosophy. The most famous problem is self-referential. The verification principle itself, the claim that a sentence is meaningful only if it is analytically true or empirically verifiable, does not appear to satisfy its own standard. It is not true by definition, and no possible observation could verify it either, since it is a claim about meaning itself, not a claim about the observable world. By its own criterion, the verification principle seems to collapse into the very nonsense it was designed to identify. Beyond this technical difficulty, philosophers of science also came to recognize that a great deal of what we consider our best and most successful scientific theorizing, including claims about unobservable entities like quarks, about the total structure of spacetime, about events before any possible observer existed to record them, does not fit comfortably within a strict verificationist framework either, and yet nobody wants to conclude that quantum field theory or the Big Bang model are meaningless nonsense. The boundary between genuine questions and pseudo-questions, it turns out, is far harder to draw with the crisp precision the positivists hoped for, and most contemporary philosophers now treat the question of why there is something rather than nothing not as obvious nonsense to be dismissed, but as a genuine, if perhaps unanswerable, question, one that sits at the outer edge of intelligibility without necessarily falling over that edge entirely. The Wittgensteinian and positivist challenge, in other words, does not so much refute the question as sharpen exactly how strange a question it is, a question that may be perfectly well-formed and still, for reasons built into its own structure rather than any contingent failure of human cleverness, incapable of receiving the kind of answer we instinctively feel it deserves. Let us turn now to a different and in some ways more unsettling angle on this problem, one that comes not from metaphysics but from the puzzle of self-selection, and from a principle that has become enormously influential in modern cosmology, the anthropic principle. The core observation behind the anthropic principle is deceptively simple. Whatever the ultimate explanation for the existence of the universe turns out to be, we can be absolutely certain before we even investigate the matter that the universe we find ourselves in is one capable of supporting observers who can ask about it. This sounds almost trivial when stated plainly, but it carries surprising explanatory weight, especially when combined with the possibility, taken seriously by many physicists, that our universe is only one among a vast ensemble of universes, each with different physical constants and different laws, arising from some process like eternal inflation or the string theory landscape, which is estimated by some physicists to allow for something on the order of 10 to the 500 possible distinct configurations of physical law. Here is why this matters for our question. Physicists have long noted that the physical constants governing our universe, the strength of gravity, the mass of the electron, the strength of the nuclear forces, the cosmological constant governing the expansion of space, appear to be extraordinarily finely tuned, sitting within astonishingly narrow ranges that permit the formation of stable atoms, stars, chemistry, and ultimately life. Nudge the strength of gravity even slightly, and stars either collapse too quickly to allow for the billions of years of stable burning required for complex chemistry to develop, or never ignite in the first place. Adjust the cosmological constant by a tiny fraction, and the universe either collapses upon itself almost immediately after any Big Bang, or expands so rapidly that matter never clumps together into galaxies and stars at all. This apparent fine-tuning has struck many physicists and philosophers as a genuine puzzle demanding explanation, and it connects directly to our larger question because it raises the possibility that the existence of a universe capable of supporting minds like ours, minds capable of even asking why there is something rather than nothing, is itself an extraordinarily improbable and special outcome. The anthropic principle offers one way of addressing this puzzle without invoking design or purpose. If there exists a vast ensemble of universes, each with randomly varied physical constants, then it is not surprising at all, that we find ourselves in one of the rare universes hospitable to life, because we could not possibly find ourselves in any of the far more numerous universes hostile to life. There is nobody there to do the finding. This is a selection effect closely analogous to the kind of reasoning statisticians use when correcting for sampling bias. If you want to know why survivors of a shipwreck report having stayed remarkably calm under pressure, part of the answer might simply be that people who panicked were less likely to survive to be interviewed. The survivors are not a random sample. They are a selected sample, filtered by the very event you are trying to explain. Similarly, observers asking why the universe is fine-tuned for life are not a random sample of all possible universes. They are, by logical necessity, filtered to appear only in the tiny subset of universes where fine-tuning happens to hold. It is worth dwelling a moment longer on just how strange the fine-tuning observations actually are, because popular science writing sometimes compresses them into a vague gesture toward improbability without conveying how specific and how startling the numbers involved actually turn out to be. Take the cosmological constant, the term in Einstein's equations that governs the rate at which empty space itself expands. Calculations from quantum field theory suggest that the natural, expected value of this constant, based on summing the contributions of all known quantum fields, should be enormous, many orders of magnitude larger than what we actually observe, so large that a universe with a naively expected value would have either torn itself apart in a runaway expansion within a fraction of a second, or collapsed into a single point almost as quickly, in either case never producing a single galaxy, let alone a single star, let alone a single planet capable of nurturing the immensely slow, patient chemistry of life. The actual observed value, discovered through the study of distant supernova in the late 1990s, is smaller than the naive theoretical expectation by a factor that some physicists have described as the single worst prediction in the history of physics, off by something on the order of 120 powers of 10. And yet that number, whatever process determined it, sits within the narrow band that permits a universe like ours, with galaxies, with stars, with chemistry, with time enough for 4 billion years of evolution on at least one small planet to produce creatures capable of noticing the coincidence at all. Similar and similarly startling sensitivities show up throughout the standard model of particle physics. The relative strengths of the four fundamental forces, the precise mass ratio between the proton and the electron, the specific resonance in the nuclear physics of carbon that allows stars to forge the carbon atoms that all known life depends upon, a resonance the physicist Fred Hoyle predicted must exist on essentially anthropic grounds before it was ever experimentally confirmed. None of these values are dictated by the equations of physics themselves. They are free parameters, numbers that had to be measured rather than derived, and as far as our current theories can tell, they could have been almost anything else. This is a genuinely clever and, in its narrow domain, genuinely successful piece of reasoning. It does real explanatory work regarding the puzzle of fine-tuning, without requiring us to invoke a cosmic designer who deliberately calibrated the constants of nature for the sake of producing life. But notice, once again, the same pattern we have now seen repeated across theology, physics, and mathematics. The anthropic principle presupposes the existence of the vast multiverse ensemble in the first place, the mechanism generating countless universes with varied constants, whether through eternal inflation, string theory's landscape of vacuum states, or some other process. It explains why we find ourselves in a life-permitting universe, given that a sufficiently large and varied ensemble of universes exists. It does not explain why any universes exist at all, why the ensemble-generating mechanism itself exists rather than nothing, why there is a landscape of possible physical laws rather than the absence of any landscape whatsoever. The anthropic principle is a powerful tool for explaining fine-tuning within an already existing framework of multiple universes. It is entirely silent on the deeper question of why there is a framework, a multiverse, an ensemble, anything at all, rather than the true, total absence we have been struggling to even conceptualize since the very beginning of this exploration. It is also worth noting that the anthropic explanation, however logically valid as a piece of selection effect reasoning, has not achieved anything close to universal acceptance among physicists, and the objections raised against it are worth understanding because they mirror, in a scientific register, the same worries philosophers have raised about explanatory shortcuts throughout this entire exploration. Critics point out that the multiverse ensembles required to make the anthropic argument work, the string theory landscape with its estimated 100 and 500 possible vacuum states, or the eternally inflating sea of bubble universes predicted by some inflationary models, are not directly observable, and likely never will be, since by their very construction these other universes lie causally disconnected from our own, forever beyond the reach of any telescope or experiment we could build. This raises a legitimate methodological worry, voiced by physicists including Paul Steinhardt and George Ellis, that multiverse reasoning risks becoming unfalsifiable in a way that sits uncomfortably with the normal standards of scientific evidence, explaining away any observed value of any constant by simply appealing to the vast unseen ensemble in which that value was bound to turn up somewhere. Defenders of the anthropic approach respond that the underlying physical theories generating the multiverse, inflationary cosmology and string theory, were developed for independent reasons to solve specific technical problems in particle physics and cosmology that have nothing directly to do with fine-tuning, and that the multiverse and the anthropic selection effect are, in a sense, unavoidable byproducts of taking those independently motivated theories seriously and following their mathematics to its natural conclusions, rather than an ad hoc invention designed solely to explain away an uncomfortable coincidence. This dispute remains active and unresolved within physics itself, and it is a useful reminder that even within the hardest of the hard sciences, the boundary between a genuine explanation and an elaborate restatement of the puzzle is not always easy to locate with confidence. There is, in fact, a further and even stranger wrinkle here, one explored by the philosopher Derek Parfit in an influential essay on this very topic. Parfit pointed out that even if we grant that a multiverse or some necessary being explains why a life-permitting universe exists, we are still left with a residual and deeply puzzling question about the overall shape of the totality of existence. Parfit imagined a range of possible total realities arranged along a spectrum from the leanest possible reality, in which literally nothing exists, through minimal realities containing perhaps a single particle, up through increasingly rich realities, all the way to what he called the widest possible reality, in which every logically possible universe, every possible law of physics, every possible arrangement of matter, all coexist simultaneously, an idea with clear affinities to Tegmark's mathematical universe hypothesis. Parfit noted an intriguing asymmetry. The very leanest reality, absolute nothing, seems like it should require no explanation, being the simplest imaginable option. But the very widest reality, in which everything possible exists, also has a strange kind of naturalness to it, an elegant simplicity of its own, because it requires no arbitrary line to be drawn, no unexplained selection of some possibilities over others. If everything possible simply exists, there is no need to explain why this particular subset of possibilities was actualized rather than some other subset, because there is no subset at all, only the totality. It is the middle ground, Parfit observed, the specific, particular, arbitrary seeming universe we actually appear to inhabit, one universe among the vast space of possibilities, neither the leanest nor the widest option, that seems to cry out most urgently for explanation, because it alone requires an account of why this much reality and not more, why these laws and not others, why a selection was made at all when both minimal nothingness and maximal everythingness would have been, in their own ways, more natural, more symmetrical, less arbitrary outcomes. Parfit's observation adds a genuinely novel dimension to the ancient question, reframing it not simply as something versus nothing, but as a puzzle about why reality landed at this particular, seemingly arbitrary point along a vast spectrum of possible richness, rather than at either extreme, which each possess their own distinct claim to a kind of explanatory simplicity. It is a reminder that even our framing of the original question, something versus nothing, as though these were the only two live options, may itself be too narrow, may be missing crucial alternatives that only become visible once you map out the full space of what a total reality could possibly look like. Everything we have examined so far has treated nothing as an external, cosmological question, a puzzle about the universe considered from the outside, as though we were accountants trying to balance the ledger of existence as a whole. But there is another current in the history of thought that approaches nothing from the inside through the structure of consciousness and experience itself, and it is worth turning to before we close, because it reframes nothingness not as an alternative to the universe but as something woven into the very fabric of being itself. The French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, in his 1943 work Being and Nothingness, took Parmenides' ancient prohibition and in a sense defied it directly, arguing that nothingness, far from being unthinkable or impossible, is in fact a permanent and inescapable feature of human experience, though not in the cosmological sense we have been discussing. Sartre distinguished between two fundamental modes of being. There is being in itself, the mode of existence proper to mere objects, a rock, a table, a tree, things that simply are what they are, fully, completely, without gap or distance from themselves. And there is being for itself, the mode of existence proper to conscious beings, to human beings, which Sartre characterized as fundamentally different because consciousness, unlike a rock, is never simply identical with itself. Consciousness is always consciousness of something, always directed outward, always at a distance from its own present state, capable of standing back from itself, judging itself, imagining itself, otherwise negating what is currently the case in favor of what could be. This capacity for negation, Sartre argued, this ability to conceive of what is not, to notice absence, to say no, to imagine alternatives to the given, means that human consciousness carries nothingness within it as a structural feature, not as an external cosmological alternative to being, but as the very hinge on which freedom turns. When you notice that your friend is absent from a cafe where you expected to find them, Sartre observed in a famous example, you do not merely fail to perceive your friend. You actively perceive an absence, a nothingness structured and specific, haunting the space where your friend was expected to be, and this perception of absence, this capacity to bring nothingness into experience, is, for Sartre, unique to conscious beings and utterly essential to what makes us free rather than merely determined, like objects, by what already is. This Sartrean nothingness is a very different creature from the cosmological nothing we have spent most of this exploration circling. It is not a rival to existence, not an alternative state the universe could have occupied instead of being. It is, instead, a permanent structural feature within existence, specifically within the existence of conscious, self-aware beings, the very thing that allows us to relate to our own lives as open, as unfinished, as something we must continually choose rather than simply be, the way a rock simply is a rock. And yet, even though Sartre's nothingness operates on a completely different register than Leibniz's or Parmenides's, it circles back, in its own way, to the same vertiginous territory we began with. To be a conscious being, on Sartre's account, is to carry a kind of internal gap, an internal distance from oneself, a permanent flicker of not quite coincidence with one's own being, and Sartre thought this was the source of a distinctive and inescapable form of anguish, the dizzying realization that nothing about who you are is fixed or guaranteed, that you are, in his phrase, condemned to be free, condemned to keep choosing yourself anew at every moment, with no essence handed down in advance to settle the matter for you. It is a strange echo, worth noticing, of the cosmological vertigo we felt at the very start of this exploration, staring into the impossibility of picturing absolute nothing. Sartre suggests that a version of that same vertigo, scaled down from the cosmos to the single human life, is not a rare philosophical mood but the basic, structural condition of being a self at all. There is yet another tradition, older than Sartre by well over 2,000 years, that approaches nothingness not as anguish but as liberation, and it is worth setting alongside the Western lineage we have followed so closely because it reaches strikingly different conclusions from strikingly similar starting observations. In the Buddhist philosophical tradition, particularly in the school of thought developed by the Indian philosopher Nagarjuna in roughly the 2nd century of the Common Era, the concept of emptiness, sunyata in Sanskrit, occupies a place of central importance, though it means something considerably more specific and more subtle than a simple absence of things. Nagarjuna's central claim was not that nothing exists in the sense of a cosmic void, but that nothing possesses what he called sabhava, usually translated as inherent, independent, self-sufficient existence. Every phenomenon we encounter, on this view, a tree, a thought, a self, a nation, a moment of time, exists only relationally, only as a temporary, dependent pattern arising in conjunction with countless other conditions, and nothing whatsoever exists as a fixed, independent, self-standing essence that could be pointed to as the bedrock, unconditioned foundation beneath the flux. Nagarjuna applied this analysis with particular rigor to causation itself, arguing through a series of famous logical arguments that a cause cannot produce an effect that already exists within it because then it would not be a new production at all, and cannot produce an effect that is entirely absent from it either because then the connection between cause and effect would be arbitrary, with nothing linking them. Causation itself, on this analysis, turns out to be, like everything else, empty of the kind of solid, independent reality we ordinarily assume it has. What makes this tradition worth placing alongside Parmenides and Leibniz is the way it treats the very drive to find a necessary, self-sufficient foundation, exactly the drive that animates Leibniz's search for a necessary being and Aquinas's search for an unmoved mover as itself a kind of conceptual error, a grasping after solid ground that the nature of reality simply does not provide, not because reality is groundless in some nihilistic or despairing sense, but because the demand for that particular kind of ground, something fixed, independent, and self-explaining, may be built on a mistaken picture of what existence is like in the first place. Where the Western tradition we have followed largely assumes that explanation must bottom out somewhere, in a necessary being or a brute law or a mathematical structure that simply is what it is, the Madhyamaka tradition that Nagarjuna founded suggests that the demand for a bottom may itself be the confusion, that dependent, relational, empty arising, all the way through, without any final, independent foundation anywhere in the system, is not a failure of explanation but an accurate description of how things actually are. This is not nihilism, and Nagarjuna was explicit and insistent on this point. Emptiness does not mean that nothing exists at all in the everyday functional sense. Cups still hold water, fires still burn, people still suffer and can still be helped. It means that the kind of independent, freestanding existence Western metaphysics has often searched for, the kind Parmenides insisted being must have, the kind Leibniz's necessary being was supposed to possess, may simply not be on offer anywhere in the universe, not because the universe is deficient, but because that was never the right way to picture what being is to begin with. Placed side by side, these two traditions, the Western search for a necessary, self-explaining foundation and the Buddhist analysis of dependent, groundless emptiness, do not resolve our original question so much as reveal how much the question itself is shaped by unexamined assumptions about what a satisfying answer would even have to look like. Perhaps the demand for a first cause, a necessary being, a brute terminus where explanation finally, triumphantly stops, is itself a culturally and cognitively specific expectation rather than a universal requirement of reason as such. And perhaps that possibility should make us a little more humble, not about whether the universe exists, which is beyond dispute, but about whether the particular shape of explanation we have been trained since childhood to expect, cause after cause after cause terminating at last in something solid, is really the only legitimate shape an answer to the deepest question could take. We have now travelled a considerable distance from Parmenides' ancient argument that non-being cannot even be coherently thought, through Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason and his conclusion that a necessary being must ground all contingent existence, through Aquinas's earlier and structurally similar cosmological argument, through the philosophical objections raised by Hume and Kant against the very coherence of necessary existence, through Bertrand Russell's suspicion that the demand for explanation illegitimately extends from parts to wholes, through the quantum cosmology of Cross and Hawking, which explains the emergence of matter and energy from a vacuum but leaves the deeper framework of physical law entirely unaccounted for, through Tegmark's radical proposal that mathematics and physical existence are simply identical, and through the anthropic principle and Parfit spectrum of possible realities which reframe but do not resolve the fundamental puzzle. At every single stop along this journey, across 2,500 years of some of the most rigorous thinking human beings have ever produced, the same basic structure keeps reappearing. Every explanation offered for the existence of something ultimately depends on some further something, some law, some structure, some necessity, some framework being available to ground it, and no explanation has ever been produced that does not, in the end, borrow existence from somewhere in order to explain existence itself. This raises a final and genuinely uncomfortable possibility, one that we have gestured towards several times already but which deserves to be confronted directly in its full weight before we close. What if the question, why is there something rather than nothing, simply has no answer, not because we have not yet found the right physics or the right metaphysics, not because some future genius will finally crack it the way Einstein cracked the mysteries of space and time, but because the question, by its very structure, outstrips the kind of thing explanation can ever, even in principle, deliver. Explanation, in every single instance we know of, in every single field of human inquiry, works by relating one thing to another thing, a fact to a prior fact, an effect to a cause, a specific instance to a general law. Explanation is fundamentally relational. It connects. It does not, and perhaps cannot, ever originate ex nihilo. To explain the totality of existence, you would need to step entirely outside existence to some vantage point that is not itself a part of what exists, and reach back in to explain why existence obtains rather than its absence. But there is no outside. There is no vantage point beyond the totality of what is, because any vantage point capable of grounding an explanation would itself have to exist, would itself be a further something absorbed back into the very domain it was supposed to be explaining from outside. The demand built into the question, in other words, may be a demand for a kind of view from nowhere that is not merely difficult to achieve but strictly, structurally impossible to achieve, not because of any limitation in human intelligence, but because of the very logic of what explanation is and what totality means. If this is right, then the question why is there something rather than nothing may belong to a peculiar and unsettling category of human inquiry, questions that are perfectly meaningful, perfectly well-formed, that grip us with genuine and undeniable force, and that nevertheless admit of no possible answer, not a hidden answer waiting to be discovered by better science or sharper logic, but no answer, full stop, because the very shape of the question asks for something that the concept of an answer cannot, even in principle, supply. It is worth being precise about what kind of impossibility this would be, because there is an important difference between a question that is merely unanswered, given the current limits of our knowledge, and a question that is unanswerable, given the very structure of what a question and an answer are. The location of a particular undiscovered exoplanet is unanswered, in the sense that we do not currently know it, but it is not unanswerable, because in principle better telescopes, more data, and more time could settle the matter completely. Whether a given very large number is prime might take a supercomputer years to determine, but the question is not unanswerable, only currently difficult in practice. The question of why there is something rather than nothing may belong to an entirely different category, one philosophers sometimes call a boundary question, a question that arises naturally and irresistibly from within a system of thought, and yet asks for a kind of information that no possible extension of that system, no matter how sophisticated, could ever in principle deliver, not because the information does not exist somewhere waiting to be found, but because the very act of answering would require a standpoint outside the total system the question is about, a standpoint that, as we discussed, cannot coherently exist. If that is the right diagnosis, then all future progress in physics, however extraordinary, however many further layers of law and structure it manages to uncover beneath the layers we currently know, quantum fields yielding to some deeper theory, that deeper theory yielding to some deeper theory still, would only ever push the question backward, never answer it. The way walking toward the horizon only ever reveals more horizon, never lets you arrive at the edge of the world and step off. This is not a criticism of physics. It is simply a recognition that physics, by its very nature as a discipline that explains some parts of reality in terms of other parts of reality, may be constitutionally incapable of ever reaching the outermost question, the question of why there is a reality with parts at all. This would not make the question worthless or foolish to ask. Some of the most important human questions may belong to exactly this category, questions whose value lies not in the destination of a final answer but in what the asking itself reveals about the structure and the limits of thought, about the strange fact that a universe of matter and energy somehow produced creatures capable of turning around and interrogating the very fact of their own existence, capable of standing, however briefly and however dizzily, at the edge of what can be known and staring into the blankness beyond it. There is a curious piece of testimony worth including here, because it suggests this vertigo is not merely a specialist's occupational hazard, confined to professional philosophers trained to notice it. Surveys of childhood memory repeatedly turn up a strikingly specific and strikingly common experience, often dated to somewhere between the ages of 5 and 10, in which a child, apparently unprompted by any book or lesson, suddenly and forcefully grasps the fact of their own existence as something strange, something that did not have to be, and is struck by a fear or an awe disproportionate to anything in their immediate surroundings, a feeling many adults recall decades later with total clarity, even when they have forgotten nearly everything else about that period of their childhood. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, who spent much of his career defending the reality and importance of exactly this kind of primitive pre-theoretical wonder against attempts to explain it away, noted that this reaction seems to arise before children have been taught any philosophy at all, which suggests that the question of why there is something rather than nothing, or at least its close cousin, the question of why there is me rather than no me, may not be an artificial puzzle manufactured by clever philosophers with too much time on their hands, but something closer to a natural and recurring feature of reflective consciousness encountering itself, arising independently again and again, in mind after mind, culture after culture, entirely without prompting. Mystics across an enormous range of religious traditions, Christian, Islamic, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, and outside any organized tradition at all, have reported strikingly similar experiences in adulthood, often precipitated by nothing more dramatic than a quiet moment of undirected attention, a sudden, overwhelming apprehension of the sheer faticity of existence, sometimes described as ecstatic, sometimes described as terrifying, and very often described as both at once an experience that resists translation into ordinary language for exactly the reasons Wittgenstein identified, and that those who have had it tend to describe afterward as more real, more significant than almost anything else that has happened to them, despite being, on the surface, an experience with no content at all beyond the bare, naked fact that anything is happening whatsoever. And perhaps this is the deepest and strangest thing to sit with as we come to the end of this exploration. Every one of us, in this precise moment, wherever we happen to be listening to these words, is proof that something happened rather than nothing. You are not merely evidence in an abstract cosmological argument. You are the very event the question is about, a localized, temporary, staggeringly improbable knot of matter that has organized itself, through billions of years of cosmic and biological history stretching back to a beginning nobody can fully explain, into a shape capable of wondering why it exists at all. The question of nothing is not really a question out there, floating in some abstract philosophical space disconnected from your life. It is a question about the very fact of you, the fact that there is a perspective here, a point of view, an experience of following these words rather than the total, silent absence that would have required no explanation whatsoever. Every act of thought you have ever had, every question you have ever asked, every love and grief and small daily wonder, all of it sits balanced on top of an unexplained and perhaps unexplainable fact, the fact that being obtains, that the frictionless, costless, effortless default of nothing did not simply remain in place forever. Sit with that image for a moment before we close. Somewhere, right now, a physicist is refining an equation that describes the first fraction of a second after the Big Bang. Somewhere, right now, a philosopher is drafting a paper defending or attacking the principle of sufficient reason with the same careful, patient rigor Leibniz brought to it 3 centuries ago. Somewhere, a child, lying awake past their bedtime, is feeling for the first time the specific, nameless vertigo of realizing that they did not have to exist, that the room around them did not have to exist, that nothing about any of this was owed. None of these people are wrong to keep going. None of this effort is wasted, even if, as this exploration has suggested, the deepest layer of the question may never yield to any of it. The going itself, the asking itself, is not a means to an end that keeps receding. It may, in some sense, be the point, the clearest evidence available to us that the something which exists instead of nothing includes, remarkably, creatures built well enough to turn and face the mystery of their own condition without looking away. Physics may one day reveal, with total precision, exactly how the earliest moments of our universe unfolded from a quantum vacuum according to precise mathematical laws. Philosophy may continue to sharpen and refine the cosmological argument, or continue to expose its weaknesses, for as long as there are minds capable of the effort. Neither of these projects is worthless. Both of them tell us something real and valuable about the structure of the something we find ourselves inside of. But underneath both projects, patient and untouched by every advance, sits the same question Leibniz posed in 1714, the same question Parmenides circled 2,000 years before that, the same question that will likely outlive every theory we currently hold, every physicist now living, every philosopher now writing, every civilization that has ever looked up at a night sky full of stars and felt the particular vertigo of realizing that none of this, not the stars, not the sky, not the mind doing the looking, had to be here at all. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why not, instead, the perfect, seamless, effortless simplicity of the void? Why anything? Why this? Why now? Why are you reading these words in a universe that did not have to exist, asking a question that may not, even in principle, have an answer, and that has never, in all the time humanity has been asking it, stopped feeling like the most important question there is?